I heard you were the best, and I have a job only suitable for the best. Odds are you won't survive it, and I can't give you any details until you say yes." The enormous Marine captain, large enough to have played linebacker for a professional football team, shook Hathcock's hand violently. A bit dumbfounded, Hathcock returned the shake, his hand numb after the captain finally released it. Hathcock's longtime spotter, Corporal Burke, was standing next to the captain in the hooch, serving as the Marine sniper headquarters for Hill 55, and looked as if he was already sold on the plan. "I'm game, Captain. I'm sure the Sarge is too." The captain shook his head. "Sorry, son, this is a one-man job. Command doesn't want to risk more than one man on what's probably a suicide mission." He turned his attention back on Hathcock. He really did admire the skinny sniper, aware of his already impressive achievements. If there was anyone who might have a chance at pulling this off, let alone surviving, it was him. "I know you're due to go home in a week. I wouldn't blame you if you turned it down. Just let me know so I can open up the job to another volunteer." The captain glanced over at Burke, and Hathcock physically recoiled at the mention of another volunteer. It was taboo to take up one last mission so close to going back home, and superstition ran deep amongst combat veterans. But if Hathcock didn't take this job, it would fall to one of his sniper students, or Burke. Then it'd be them dead out in the bush while he sat on his fat behind, happily flying home. "I'll do it." The whirlybird's blades chopped into the night air. Hathcock shook his head. He'd gotten himself in deep on this one. For the 100th time since departing Hill 55, he checked the plastic laminated map. It had no borders or names on it, so he had no idea what part of the country it represented. He wasn't even sure it was Vietnam. But judging by the direction of his helicopter flight, it was either deep inside Laos or even North Vietnam itself. The job was simple. All he had to do was shoot a North Vietnamese general, someone who'd become a significant thorn in the U.S.'s side. More than eliminating the threat, America wanted to send a message. No matter where you are, we can reach you. The killing would be both a blow to the NVA's strategic capabilities and its morale. That is, if Hathcock wasn't killed before ever getting a chance to fire. The NVA general was deep in an unspecified compound. The less Hathcock knew, the less he could give up if captured. Names didn't matter anyway, only layout, terrain features, security measures, the things that stood between him and his prey. It was a bona fide NVA fort, complete with anti-air guns under camo netting, machine guns on towers, barbed wire, and minefields. The intel guys weren't sure if the enemy had dogs, but Hathcock hoped they didn't. Dogs could be a death sentence for a sniper. He guessed by the fact that the fort hadn't been bombed into splinters meant that he was flying pretty deep into Laos, past the border region which had become a politically acceptable free-fire zone for U.S. Air Force bombers snuffing out NVA and VC supply convoys. The night air had an unusual chill. If Hathcock was lucky, that would mean rain. Rain would be a godsend. It would muffle his movements and make it difficult to spot the trail leading to his shooting position. Sitting on the edge of the rainforest, Hathcock sipped from his canteen and surveyed the vast field in front of him. His face was covered in light and dark green grease paint, as were his hands and neck. His uniform and gear were studded with various bits of vegetation, so that even now, as he leaned against the trunk of a tree, he resembled a lump of wild growth more than a man. Getting here from that helicopter drop-off point had been practically a walk in the park, thanks to all the cover. What lay ahead of him was suicide. Over 2,000 yards of open field lay between him and his target. The only cover, a foot-tall growth of yellowing grass. At the other end, he could clearly spot the machine gun emplacements built up on high towers, their gunners no doubt making use of binoculars to scan the terrain. NVA patrols wound their way randomly through the field, making a big circle around the fort. He'd only get one shot at his target, and he didn't want to risk such an extreme long-distance shot that even he, with all his skill and experience, wasn't confident he'd land. No, to do the job right, he'd have to get in close, at least to 800 yards. That meant traversing 1,200 yards of open ground with random NVA patrols swarming across it. But getting to a firing position would be the easy part. The hard part would come after. The moment he took his shot, the entire place would be in an uproar. NVA swarming everywhere. It would be hopeless to try to outrun the big machine guns or the mortars he was sure the fort also had. He'd have to get out the same way he went in, invisibly. It was time to get started. Hathcock took one final sip from his canteen. From this moment on, he wouldn't eat again. The movement would be too risky, and he'd rarely drink. Plucking at strands of yellowish grass, he'd begin to replace the dark green vegetation he'd attached to his body and rifle as camouflage. Hathcock crawled slowly, deliberately, moving at a pace of a few yards an hour. His movements would be nearly imperceptible, even to a man standing only a few feet away. Sunrise would be coming soon, and he was already too far from the tree line to retreat safely if anything went wrong. He was fully committed. At the rate it was going, it would take him nearly 2 days to reach his shooting position. Hathcock couldn't rush things, though. He had to be patient. If he wasn't, he'd be dead. Suddenly, there was the sound of voices in the distance, drawing closer. Hathcock froze, his arm outstretched from his crawl. All he was carrying for defense was his rifle, nearly useless at close range, and the K-bar knife at his waist, also useless in a close gunfight. His only defense was to remain unseen and undetected. The voices grew louder, young men laughing and joking while out on patrol. Their lack of discipline confirmed Hathcock's suspicion that he was in fact somewhere deep behind enemy lines, too deep for any hope of rescue. Here, the men on patrol felt safe enough to kid around while patrolling the perimeter. And why shouldn't they? Other than a massive air raid, it would be suicide to attack this position with anything short of an entire armed battalion. Suddenly, a boot appeared directly in front of Hathcock, landing just an inch away from his arm. Hathcock considered pulling his arm out of the way of the patrol, but the movement might give him away. There was nothing he could do now but hope. The man moved, and then another pair of feet went by, this time a little farther away. Hathcock gave a silent prayer of thanks. The men moved on into the darkness, unaware of how close they had come to the infamous White Feather, the U.S. Marine sniper with a bounty on his head so high it would have made any of them rich beyond their wildest dreams. Confident the patrol had moved on, Hathcock began his slow crawl once more, moving centimeters at a time. He taught himself to sleep with his eyes open, taking short 10-minute stints. It was a form of self-hypnosis. He had no clue how he developed the ability, but the micro-naps left him surprisingly refreshed, which was good because real sleep would likely get him killed. Early in the morning, Hathcock caught the first sight of his prey, a short, balding general with a paunch belly. He watched as the general looked over the defensive works surrounding his headquarters. A large home Hathcock guessed had once been a French plantation. The general was too far to take a shot at, though, and once he finished his inspection, he went back inside the house. "I'll get you soon, you hot dog." Hathcock continued crawling forward, taking a short rest every few hours. When the late afternoon came, he saw a white sedan pull up to the house, and the general, still far too distant for a shot, came out of the home and got inside. This was a lucky break for Hathcock. He knew that meant the local security would be lax until the general's return, and he allowed himself to accelerate his crawl, a whole extra 16 inches per hour. His body burned from dozens of insect bites and stings. At one point, he crawled right through a trail of ants that had made their way into his clothing to deliver their tiny wrath. He ignored the bites and stings, though he wondered just how many ant bites it would take to kill a man. He wasn't sure of the species or even if they were venomous. Eventually, the ants got bored of making him their chew toy, or maybe he had finally crawled far enough away to no longer be a threat to them because they left him. That only made room for the other creepy crawlies, the field in the middle of the vast jungle being in no short supply of them. A few hours after nightfall, the general returned home. At that same time, an NVA patrol made its way out of the compound and started straight towards Hathcock, but their eyes were locked on the distant tree line. The 12 men walked right by Hathcock, completely unaware of the American Marine hiding in their midst. Once they were safely behind him, he resumed his crawl, less than half a finger length at a time. His destination was a gully that he'd spotted on aerial photographs. It looked to be a very shallow depression. Hathcock estimated no more than half a foot, but it was wide enough for a man to lay in. The gully ran from where he planned to take his shot all the way to the tree line, where he could try to make an escape. Hunger was working at him now. It had been 2 days since starting his crawl, and the only thing he'd allowed himself in that time was small drinks of water. Getting out the C-ration crackers and a packet of peanut butter he carried would require far too much movement. He lived on crackers and peanut butter for most of his tours in Vietnam, normal C-rations being far too bulky for a sniper to carry out into the field. And right now, that peanut butter and crackers sounded as good as a gourmet steak dinner. He pushed the thought from his mind. The last thing he needed to think about in his hungry state was steak dinners. Inching forward, he delicately parted a strand of grass. All the thoughts of food immediately vanished as a violent fear seized Hathcock. A deep, chilling cold ran down his spine and into his legs, and Hathcock had to use every ounce of discipline to keep himself from leaping up in a panic. Just behind that strand of grass that he parted, no more than 6 inches in front of him, was a coiled, jade-green bamboo viper. The creature's red eyes took in Hathcock's sudden appearance through the grass, and its emerald head lifted slowly to stare at him, its tongue flickering as it tasted the air. One bite, even a small one, and he would be dead in minutes. He lay out there in this field, likely only discovered by the NVA patrols when his body started to rot or scavengers began to gather. He fought the urge to duck back. The sudden movement might give him away to an alert sentry. It might also startle the snake into biting. There was nothing he could do but stay absolutely perfectly still and hope that the snake did not see him as a threat. The bamboo viper flicked its tongue again, clearly tasting the stink of sweat from Hathcock's face and body. It recognized the specific scent. It was the scent of danger that often came with loud noises and the trampling of grass, trampling that threatened to crush the snake underfoot. It was the scent of a threat. But this one was different. There were no loud noises, no sudden movements or trampling of grass. The snake dipped its head and made up its mind. With a final flick of its tongue, the snake turned its head and slithered slowly into the grass. With a sigh of relief, Hathcock finally remembered to breathe. The adrenaline began to clear from his system. His blood sugar was low, and with no food in his system, the sudden drop in adrenaline gave him a bad case of the shakes. There was nothing he could do to stop them, so Hathcock simply lay in the grass, waiting to regain control over his own body. Darkness was falling once more. Hathcock could see his shooting position now, just 200 yards ahead. He could also make out much more detail in the house. He'd been watching couriers coming and going all day, the general receiving news and dispatching orders. The patrol that came and went were more focused on the distant tree line than the grass around them. But judging by their attitude, they weren't too concerned about a ground assault coming through those trees. The sunk-in fighting position with heavy sandbag cover on the tops and the anti-aircraft guns told him that they were far more concerned with an air assault. Good, Carlos thought. They'd never see a ground threat coming. He could take his shot from here. He won the Wimbledon Cup at 1,000 yards along with numerous other tournaments and competitions, striking bullseyes or in the V-ring every time. This would be no different, no harder a shot. No, Hathcock thought. That's the voice of compromise. This shot was more important than any tournament shot he'd ever taken. Even the Wimbledon Cup that recognized him as the best marksman in North America. He pushed the thought out of his mind and pulled himself forward again, his arms and legs covered in bug bites, stings, and grassy splinters. His joints ached. He longed to stand up and stretch. Every muscle in his body seemed to scream in pain, and he desperately needed food. But he pushed all those thoughts away and crawled. The gully was shallow, only 6 inches deep, but as Hathcock had predicted, it was just wide enough for a man to lay in. It wouldn't be much cover, but it increased his survival odds dramatically. Hathcock crawled to where a slight rise presented a natural shooting position he could rest the barrel of his rifle on. In front of that rifle, he laid out a piece of cloth that would prevent the expelled gases coming out of the barrel from stirring up the dust and giving away his position. Looking through the scope, he scanned the compound with greater clarity than ever before and waited. The next day, Hathcock told himself, the general would die. To celebrate, Hathcock allowed himself the luxury of a small sip of water. Getting the canteen to his lips took him half an hour. The first rays of dawn found Hathcock with an eye already pressed to the scope. The old plantation was coming to life. Guards at the machine gun positions were changing shifts as camp aides began to get around to their morning tasks. From the plantation house itself, a puff of smoke signaled the cooking of a meal inside, probably the general's breakfast. If Hathcock had his way, it would be his last meal. He scanned his sightline, watching the movement of the grass and the slight breeze. Closer to the house, he watched how the smoke from one of the guard post's cooking fires moved as it wafted into the air, pushing slightly to the left at around 10 feet off the ground. Once the sun was fully up and bathing the scene below, he watched for the heat mirage shimmering off the roof of the plantation home. It too shifted to the left as the wind moved through it. He watched carefully, calculating his angles, determining his wind speed. He'd done it 1,000 times before, both at home on the gun ranges and out here in the bush, when lives were on the line. But he still ran the calculations twice, 3 times, 10 times. He had to be sure. Then it was time. The sound of the white sedan starting up somewhere behind the house nearly caused him to jerk in surprise. The fancy vehicle pulled out and around to the front of the house, stopping at the porch. Half a minute later, the general stepped out of the door. He was standing with his side to Hathcock's position. He couldn't risk a profile shot, though. To ensure a kill, he'd have to put the bullet through the man's neck, And while he was confident in his abilities and his calculations, this shot was too important to risk on anything but a sure thing. If he had to, he'd wait all day, all night, and even until tomorrow if necessary, to make sure that he got his shot. The Marine patrol he was supposed to rendezvous with the following morning would have to board the chopper without him. He'd find his own way home, somehow. The shot was all that mattered. He waited, watching patiently. All the general needed to do was turn, either facing toward him or away. Both would give him the shot he needed. Several aides were in conversation with the general, no doubt briefing him on last-minute details. Get out of the way, Hathcock thought, urging the aides to move, and to his surprise, the group suddenly began to disperse, one leading the general to the vehicle. Hathcock's crosshairs followed the man's every movement. The sun was now fully up in the sky and heating the land below it. Hathcock calculated the effect that the elevated temperature would have on the burn rate of the powder in the cartridge of his loaded round. It would burn faster, causing the bullet to elevate as it traveled. He moved the crosshairs a few inches higher than normal. At this range, with an accelerated burn rate, the bullet would be in its downward trajectory when it reached the general. The NVA general approached the waiting car, the driver already having opened the door for him. Okay, now stop. Hathcock thrust his mind out at the general. To his shock, the man stopped, turning slightly to face an aide and presenting his chest to Hathcock. Hathcock's crosshairs were placed on the man's left breast pocket, just in case the wind picked up as the bullet traveled and caused it to shift in its flight path. Shooting fundamentals ran through Hathcock's brain, his body obeying by instinct. Smooth, easy trigger pull, don't jerk it. Wait for the natural pause and breathing pattern. Don't try to hold your breath. A sharp crack rang out. In less than 3/4 of a second, the heavy 7.62 by 63 millimeter round crossed the distance to the general. About 3/4 of the way to its target, the warm gunpowder had caused the bullet to rise early in its flight, and as it reached the target, it was already arcing downwards. The bullet punched through the manubrium, the broad upper part of the sternum, a half-inch off the center line of the general's body. The bullet, already losing energy before striking the general, was slightly deflected in its path by the manubrium, causing it to arc up into the left, completely severing the brachiocephalic vein. The vein, bringing in oxygen-starved blood from the head, upper chest, and arms straight to the heart, began to flood the chest cavity with blood at an alarming rate. The bullet, however, continued in its trajectory, imparting over 1,000 joules of kinetic energy into the spinal column, shattering it and disintegrating a large chunk near the bullet's impact point, causing the weight of the upper spinal column to collapse down onto the weakened section. The bullet exited the general's chest in a tumble, tearing a large hole through his flesh and uniform as it embedded itself into the side of the vehicle. The general fell straight back. For a moment, the camp aides could only stare at what had just happened in front of them in wide-eyed disbelief before reality suddenly came rushing in and they dropped to the ground and crawled for cover. Soldiers began shouting out. Machine gun fire lit up the tree lines behind and around Hathcock. Sergeant Hathcock was already crawling down the 6-inch deep gully toward the safety of the distant tree line. On the way, he'd moved at a rate of inches an hour. Now he was moving at a brisk pace, but still only measured in a few dozen feet an hour. Even as NVA patrols swarmed out of the compound, he forced himself to remain calm, his movements to remain slow but steady. The enemy soldiers poured through the field, but their attention was in the wrong direction, focused on the distant tree line. Meanwhile, Hathcock's movements were nothing more than a whisper in the grass, easily mistaken for a slight breeze that occasionally stirred across the field on what was quickly becoming another unpleasantly hot and muggy Vietnam day. They never had any idea that the man who took down their general was so close. Soon he'd reach the safety of the forest, and in 4 days he was due for a freedom bird back home.